When you trust someone with your whole soul and discover betrayal right under your nose, the entire world seems to crumble in a single instant. That's how I felt on that fateful Sunday in July 1965. Good morning, my dears. I'm Mrs. Teresa Oliveira. I'm 75 years old, and today I'm going to share with you a story I've kept deep in my heart for many years. Before I begin, I'd like to ask you who are watching me now to leave your like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It would be a joy to know that my story is reaching so many different places. I was born in 1950 in a small town in rural Tennessee called Millbrook. A town so small that everybody knew everybody. The windows had eyes and the walls had ears, as we used to say back then. I married at 19 to Anthony, a young man who worked at the town bank and who all the girls swooned over when he passed by. Tall, with black hair, neatly combed, and a smile that lit up any room. I remember our wedding as if it were yesterday. My dress was sewn by my mother with delicate white fabric that my father bought in Nashville after months of saving. The church was all decorated with wildflowers that my cousins picked on the morning of the wedding. In the first years, we lived in a dream. We built our simple but cozy little house with a backyard where I planted my vegetables and flowers. Soon came the children, first Joseph, then Marianne, and finally little Robert. 3 children to raise and a house to care for, but still I worked at the only textile mill in town. It was hard work, but it gave me a little money that helped with expenses and allowed me to have some independence, something rare for women of that era. It was at the mill that I met Margaret, or rather, reconnected with her. We had been friends since elementary school, but lost touch when she moved to Nashville. When she returned married years later, it was as if time hadn't passed. We worked side by side at the machines, shared lunch, told secrets, showed photos of our children. Margaret became my confidant, that person to whom I told everything. Absolutely everything. She knew every detail of my life, every dream, every frustration. Anthony and her husband Sebastian also got along well. On Sundays off, the families would gather for long lunches in my backyard or hers. The children played together while we adults talked about life, about plans for the future, about the town's problems. They were simple moments, but they brought me genuine happiness. I really believed I had built a perfect life. Work at the mill was exhausting. We spent the entire day standing amid the deafening noise of the machines, breathing in fabric dust, with our hands always hurt and calloused. But there was solidarity among us women. We helped each other, shared pains and joys. And at the center of that support network was Margaret, always smiling, always willing to extend a hand when someone needed it. When Robert, my youngest, got sick with pneumonia and I needed to miss work for a week, it was Margaret who offered to cover my shift so I wouldn't lose my job. When Anthony was promoted at the bank and we had a small celebration, it was Margaret who helped prepare everything, who decorated the house with colored crepe paper and made that cornbread cake that was her specialty. When I needed someone to vent to about difficulties in marriage, the small disagreements, the unmet expectations, it was on Margaret's shoulder that I cried. My life followed its normal course, with the joys and difficulties typical of a woman in the 60s, until I began to notice small changes in Anthony's behavior. At first, they were subtle things, so small that I almost doubted what I saw. A shirt with a different perfume, a discreet lipstick stain on his collar that he said was from an elderly lady at the bank who always greeted him with a kiss. Money that disappeared without explanation. Phone calls that he answered quickly and soon hung up when I entered the room. But what really began to intrigue me was the Sunday ritual. After lunch, invariably, Anthony would say he was tired from the week at the bank and needed to sleep deeply. He insisted that I visit my mother or my sisters so the house would be quiet for his rest. At first, I saw nothing wrong with that. After all, work at the bank was stressful and everyone needs moments of rest. I took advantage to take the children for a walk, visit family, or simply stroll through the town square. Over time, however, I began to notice strange looks between Anthony and Margaret during our gatherings, contained giggles when they crossed paths on the street. And curiously, Margaret always asked about my plans for Sunday afternoons. "Are you going to visit your mother after lunch, Teresa?" she would ask, with an interest that at the time seemed just friendly concern. I remember perfectly the first time I felt that pang of suspicion. It was a regular day at the mill. We were, as always, side by side at the machines. Margaret seemed distracted, with deep dark circles under her eyes, but a constant smile on her lips. When I asked if everything was okay, she replied yes, that she just hadn't slept well. Spent Sunday afternoon at home alone. Sebastian went fishing with friends. "I was just thinking about life, that's all," she said. But that same morning earlier, Sebastian had stopped by the mill to bring the lunch she had forgotten at home, and excitedly commented about the football game he had watched with friends on Sunday afternoon at George's house. He said nothing about fishing. It was a small contradiction that could have been just a misunderstanding, but something inside me set off an alert. From there, I began to pay more attention. I noticed how Margaret became agitated on Fridays, talking about weekend plans. How she always showed up with something new on Mondays: lipstick, a scarf, a pair of earrings, small gifts she said she bought for herself because every woman deserves to feel beautiful. I noticed how she casually asked about Anthony's schedules, about when he would be home or at the bank. And Anthony, my Anthony, also began to act differently, more careful with his appearance, using more cologne, always checking his watch on Sundays, anxious for me to leave with the children. There was even a Sunday when he got irritated because Robert had a slight fever and I decided to stay home to care for him. "You don't need to stay, Teresa. It's just a little fever. Take him to your mother to care for." "You know I need to rest," he insisted with an irritation that didn't match his generally calm personality. It was that night, with Robert finally sleeping after the fever broke, that I decided I needed to know the truth. I couldn't continue living with that suspicion growing inside me like a weed, slowly suffocating all the love and trust I had built over the years. Next Sunday, I would discover what happened in my absence. Next Sunday, I would face the truth, whatever it was. And that's what I did. On the morning of that Sunday, I prepared lunch as always: roast chicken, his favorite, with stuffing, salad, and rice. The children were excited because after lunch they would go to my sister's house where they could play with their cousins. I announced as usual that I would take them and would spend the afternoon with my family. Anthony smiled, that smile that once made my heart race, and said it was a great idea, that he really needed to rest. We left after lunch, me and the 3 children. I left them at my sister's house and said I would return later to pick them up. "I'm going to stop by the church and then do some shopping at the grocery store," I explained. My sister asked no questions. We were used to this arrangement on Sundays. But instead of going to the church or the grocery store, I went around the block and returned to near my house. My heart beat so hard I could feel its pulse in my ears. My hands trembled and a cold sweat ran down my back despite the warm July day. I hid behind the large tree on the corner, from where I could see the entrance to our house without being seen. I didn't have to wait long. About 20 minutes after I left, I saw Margaret walking hurriedly down the street. She looked around, checking if there was no one watching, and then entered the gate of my house. The front door opened before she even knocked. Anthony was waiting for her. In that moment, I felt as if all the air had been sucked from my lungs. Suspicion is one thing, but confirmation is something completely different. Seeing your best friend entering your house in your husband's arms when you supposedly wouldn't be there to see it is a pain I can't describe with words. I was paralyzed for a few minutes, not knowing what to do. Part of me wanted to run home, surprise them, scream, cry, demand explanations. Another part wanted to simply leave, get the children, and never return. But there was a third part, the strongest at that moment, that needed to see with my own eyes. I needed to be absolutely sure before making any decision that would forever change my life and that of my children. I approached the window with silent steps, as if my own feet understood the gravity of the moment. What I saw through that window, hazed by time, was etched in my memory like a photograph that never yellows. There in the living room of my own house, Margaret was in Anthony's arms. It wasn't a hug of friends, nor comfort for some sadness. They were kissing with an intimacy that can only exist between people who have shared this kind of affection for a long time. The coffee table that I had bought with so much sacrifice, saving penny by penny from my mill salary, was covered with a tablecloth I had embroidered myself. On top of it, 2 wine glasses. The wine we saved for special occasions that Anthony said was too expensive to consume regularly. Beside it, a plate with those cinnamon cookies that only Margaret knew how to make, the same ones she brought for our lunches at the mill and that I praised so much. I felt my legs weaken and needed to lean against the wall to avoid falling. The sensation was of watching a movie about someone else's life. How could it be my life, my house, my husband, and my best friend in that scene that shattered my heart into 1,000 pieces? The room was exactly as I had left it, except for one detail. The portrait from our wedding, which always sat on the sideboard, was turned face down. That hit me like a slap. They couldn't look at our photo while they gave themselves to that forbidden encounter. At least that minimum of shame remained. I stayed paralyzed, watching long enough to hear fragments of their conversation. They talked about me, about how I was naive, about how easy it was to deceive me for so long. Margaret laughed as she told how I had vented to her about my insecurities in marriage, never suspecting she was the cause of them. Anthony commented on how I never questioned his deep Sunday sleeps, how I was so predictable in my routines. "She never suspected?" asked Margaret, nestled in his chest, the same chest where I rested my head on the rare nights when Anthony still showed me affection. "Teresa? Never. She's too busy with the children and the house to notice anything," he replied with a laugh that cut me deeper than any knife could. It was when Margaret said something that made me understand the extent of that betrayal. "How long has it been?" 3 years. Almost 4, Anthony corrected, kissing her again. 4 years. 4 years of lies, of deception, of false friendship. 4 years in which I shared my pains and joys with the woman who was destroying my marriage. 4 years in which I confided my marital insecurities precisely to the person who caused them. The irony was so cruel, I almost laughed, a bitter laugh that stuck in my throat and turned into a silent sob. In that moment, I remembered so many details that before seemed insignificant. Christmas 1963, when Margaret appeared wearing a pearl brooch identical to one I had seen in Anthony's drawer weeks before, and that mysteriously disappeared. He said he had returned it to the store because it was too expensive. Anthony's birthday in 1964, when Margaret knew exactly what his favorite cake was before I even mentioned it. The countless times she showed up at the mill wearing a cologne that reminded me of Anthony, and when I questioned her, she said she had received it from Sebastian, the same Sebastian who could barely remember her birthday. As these memories invaded my mind, they continued in the living room, completely oblivious to my presence. I saw when Anthony stood up and grabbed something from the shelf, a small package he handed to her. Margaret opened it with the excitement of a child, revealing a pair of gold earrings, the same ones I had admired in the store window downtown a few weeks earlier when we passed by there after Mass. I commented to Anthony how beautiful they were, and he responded, "They were too expensive for our budget." Apparently, they weren't too expensive to gift his mistress. "They're beautiful. I'll wear them tomorrow at the mill," said Margaret, putting them on immediately. "Don't be foolish," reprimanded Anthony. "Teresa will recognize them. Only wear them when you're with me." Those words hit me like lightning. It wasn't just an impulsive betrayal, a momentary mistake. It was calculated, planned, carefully orchestrated so I would never discover. They had rules. They had a system. They had a routine within my own house, using my objects, drinking my wine, laughing at my naivety. I couldn't take it anymore. I moved away from the window with my heart beating irregularly and my breath interrupted by sobs I struggled to contain. I couldn't be discovered there, not at that moment. I needed to think. I needed to breathe. I needed to understand what I would do with that revelation that had just turned my life upside down. I walked aimlessly through the town streets, barely seeing the path ahead because of the tears that blurred my vision. I ended up arriving at the central square, the same one where Anthony proposed to me 16 years before, kneeling under the large dogwood tree that bloomed at that time of year. I sat on a secluded bench where no one could see me and let the tears flow freely. Hours passed without me noticing. When I realized it, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink that seemed to mock the darkness I felt inside me. I needed to pick up the children at my sister's house. I needed to pretend nothing had happened, at least for now. I needed to wash my face, pull myself together, force a smile so my children wouldn't notice their world was about to collapse. That night was the longest of my life. I returned home with the children as if it were a normal Sunday. Margaret had already left, of course. Anthony was sitting in the living room armchair, reading the newspaper with a serene expression, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just betrayed the trust and love of the woman who swore to respect until death separated them. "How was the afternoon at your sister's?" he asked casually, lowering the newspaper for a moment. I swallowed hard, forcing the words to come out. It was good. The children played a lot with their cousins. He nodded and returned to the newspaper, without even noticing my swollen eyes, my trembling hands, the tremor in my voice, or perhaps he noticed and simply didn't care enough to ask. That night, lying beside the man who had just shattered my heart, I kept my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Silent tears ran down my face, wetting the pillow. Beside me, Anthony slept deeply, without any sign of remorse or restlessness. How could he sleep so peacefully after such betrayal? How could he breathe calmly while I suffocated with the pain of discovery? The next morning, I got up before him, as usual. I prepared coffee, got the children ready for school, prepared Anthony's lunchbox for work. Automatic movements, like a wind-up doll that continues moving even after the music has stopped. When it was time for me to go to the mill, I felt such a strong tightness in my stomach, I thought I would faint. How would I face Margaret? How would I look into the eyes of the woman I considered a sister and who I now knew was my most intimate enemy? How would I work side by side with her, listen to her stories, her laughter, knowing that behind that friendly smile hid a 4-year lie? I arrived at the mill a few minutes late, something rare for me who had always been punctual. The deafening noise of the machines greeted me as always, but that day it seemed to amplify the storm raging inside me. Margaret was already there at the machine next to mine, like every day. When she saw me, she smiled and waved, as if we were still best friends, as if she hadn't been in my husband's arms less than 24 hours before. "Good morning, Teresa. How was Sunday with the family?" she asked in the same sweet voice as always, but which now sounded like the worst of insults. I looked at her for a long moment, observing every detail of her face. The carefully applied red lipstick, the impeccable hairstyle, the bright eyes, all to look beautiful for whom? For my husband, obviously. And then I noticed on her ears, partially hidden by her hair, were the gold earrings, the same ones Anthony had given her the day before, the same ones he warned her not to wear near me. She had deliberately disobeyed. She was wearing the earrings in front of me, testing me, challenging me to say something. Or perhaps it was just carelessness, arrogance, the certainty that I would never notice, that I was too foolish to make the connection. "It was revealing," I finally responded, staring at her with a firmness that made her hesitate for a second. "Revealing? What do you mean?" she asked, a slight tremor in her voice. "Some things become clear when you least expect them, Margaret," I said, starting my machine and beginning to work as if nothing had happened. I saw from the corner of my eye when she instinctively brought her hand to her ears, touching the earrings. I saw the exact moment when she realized the mistake she had made, the momentary panic that crossed her gaze before she could disguise it. "Nice earrings," I commented without looking at her. "New?" "Oh, yes," she stammered. Sebastian gave them to me for our anniversary. You know how it is." "I know exactly how it is," I responded, my eyes fixed on the fabric passing through the machine. Curiously, I saw identical earrings in the store window downtown, those I commented on with Anthony after Mass. Coincidence, don't you think? Her silence was more revealing than any confession. For hours we worked side by side, without exchanging more words beyond what was strictly necessary for the job. The air between us was charged with tension, with unspoken truths, with exposed betrayals without needing direct confrontations. At lunchtime, instead of sitting with Margaret and the other women, as I always did, I chose a secluded bench in the mill courtyard. I needed space to think, to breathe, to decide what I would do with that truth that now weighed on my shoulders. It didn't take long for Margaret to come to me, sitting beside me uninvited. Her face was pale, her hands trembled slightly as she held her lunchbox. "Teresa, we need to talk," she said in a low voice, looking around to make sure no one would hear us. "About what?" I asked, keeping my voice firm despite the whirlwind of emotions consuming me inside. You know, don't you?" she murmured, her voice almost disappearing. I looked directly into her eyes, the same eyes that so many times looked at me with false compassion while I vented about my marital insecurities. "I know many things, Margaret. I know that true friendship doesn't exist in this town. I know that trust is a rare coin and that I spent mine on the wrong people. And I know you're wearing earrings my husband bought for you with money that could be feeding his children." Her eyes widened and she almost dropped her lunchbox. "Teresa, I can explain." "Explain what?" "How you two laughed at my naivety yesterday afternoon in my own living room, drinking my wine?" Margaret's face lost all color, as if she had seen a ghost. And perhaps she had indeed seen the ghost of the friendship she murdered with her own hands. Her lips trembled, trying to form words that wouldn't come. You were there? You saw?" she finally whispered, her voice so low it was almost swallowed by the noise of the mill around us. I didn't respond immediately. I let the weight of silence speak for me. I let her feel at least a fraction of the anguish I felt. I watched as tears began to form in the corners of her eyes. Tears of regret or just fear of being discovered? I would never know. "What do you expect me to say now, Margaret? That it's okay? That I understand? That I forgive?" "It didn't happen like you think," she began, the words coming out stumbling. "In the beginning, it was just conversation. Anthony felt lonely. He said you didn't understand him, that you were always busy with the children. Those words hit me like stones. So it was my fault for being busy caring for the children I had with him? For working at the mill to help with household expenses that we built together?" "Spare me your excuses," I cut in, keeping my voice low but firm. 4 years, Margaret. 4 years of lies. While you hugged me with one arm, with the other you hugged my husband behind my back." She lowered her eyes, unable to sustain my gaze. What are you going to do?" The question hung in the air between us. What would I do? A question I had been asking myself since the moment I saw the two of them together in my living room. What does a 35-year-old woman do with 3 children to raise without her own resources beyond a mill worker's salary in a small town in the 60s when she discovers she's been betrayed by her husband and best friend? "I don't know yet," I responded honestly. "But you and I are done. The machine next to mine is vacant starting today. Request a transfer to another sector or find another job because I won't be able to look at you every day without feeling disgust." I stood up, leaving her sitting alone on the courtyard bench, with tears now flowing freely down her face. I felt no pity, no remorse. At that moment, I only felt an enormous void where once existed a friendship I considered unshakable. I returned to my machine before the break ended, ignoring the curious looks from the other women who certainly noticed the scene in the courtyard. Margaret didn't return to work that afternoon. She sent a message through another worker saying she was feeling ill and needed to go home. Cowardly to the end. Upon returning home that day, I found Anthony in the living room, reading the newspaper as if it were just another ordinary day. He briefly raised his eyes when I entered, threw me a casual good afternoon, and returned to his reading, as if he hadn't spent Sunday afternoon in my best friend's arms in that same armchair. That night, after the children slept, I confronted him. I didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't make a scene. I simply said, "I know about you and Margaret." He slowly lowered the newspaper, his eyes fixed on mine, looking for some sign of doubt or hesitation. He found none. "What are you talking about, Teresa?" he tried, but his voice already revealed he knew exactly what I was talking about. "Sunday, I came back. I saw you two in our living room, heard your conversation. 4 years, Anthony. 4 years of lies." His face changed. The mask of innocence fell, revealing first surprise, then irritation. No trace of regret. "And what are you going to do?" he asked with the same arrogance of someone who knows they hold all the cards. The same question Margaret had asked hours before. What would I do? In Millbrook in 1965, a separated woman was a marked woman. A shame to the family, target of gossip, excluded from society, not to mention the practical difficulties. How would I support 3 children alone on my millworker's salary? How would I pay rent for a house? How would I explain to the children? "I don't know yet," I responded honestly, "but I know I can't continue living in this lie." He laughed then. A dry laugh, devoid of humor. "And where will you go, Teresa? Back to your parents' house with 3 children? Live on your sister's charity? Maybe you can rent a little room in the back of some yard. With what you earn at the mill, it's barely enough to buy food, much less pay rent." Each word was like a knife, cutting deep, exposing the raw truth of my situation. He was right, and he knew it. I was trapped. "The children need a father," he continued, his voice now softer, as if speaking to a child who needs to understand an obvious truth. "You need a husband. What happened, happened, but it doesn't mean anything. Margaret doesn't mean anything." 4 years mean nothing? I asked, my voice trembling with indignation. He shrugged, as if we were discussing what movie to watch at the cinema, not about the betrayal that destroyed our family. "It's what men do, Teresa. You're too naive. Ask any woman in town if her husband never had an affair. The difference is they're smart enough to pretend they don't know, not to see what's in front of their eyes. They understand how the world works." That conversation ended without resolution. Me, paralyzed by the reality of my situation. Him, secure in the certainty that I had no option but to accept and move forward. In the following weeks, I lived in a kind of limbo. I continued caring for the house, the children, working at the mill. Margaret requested a transfer to another sector, which meant we didn't need to work side by side anymore. But we still occasionally crossed paths in the hallways or cafeteria. She would lower her eyes and quickly move away, as if I were carrying some contagious disease. Anthony continued with his routine as if nothing had happened. The only difference was he no longer insisted for me to leave on Sunday afternoons. Somehow, that made everything even worse, knowing they had simply transferred their meetings to another place, perhaps her house when Sebastian was away, or some rented room in the neighboring town. The nights were the worst. Lying beside him, separated only by inches that seemed like miles, I wondered how I had gotten to that situation, where I had gone wrong, what I could have done differently. Questions that only led me to more pain, more doubts, more sleepless nights. I began to notice pitying looks from the town women when they saw me at the market, at church, at the school door picking up the children. The whispers that abruptly ceased when I approached, the forced smiles, the superficial questions about how I was, without really wanting to hear the answer. The news had spread, as everything spreads in a small town. Everyone knew, everyone commented, and everyone waited to see what foolish Teresa would do. "Teresa, dear, you need to think about the children," said my mother when I finally gathered courage to confide in her. "A home without a father isn't a home. Anthony made a mistake, but what man doesn't make mistakes? The important thing is, he supports the family, doesn't hit you, doesn't drink. But Mom, how can I continue living with a man who betrayed me with my best friend for 4 years, who laughed at me behind my back, who's only with me because he knows I have nowhere to go? She sighed, taking my hands between hers, calloused by decades of hard work. Daughter, I know it hurts. Believe me, I know. But sometimes we need to swallow our pride for the greater good. Think of Joseph, of Marianne, of little Robert. They deserve to grow up with a father, in a decent house, with food on the table. And you, what would become of you as a separated woman in this town? Doors would close, invitations would stop coming, the children would be pointed at in school. Is that what you want? I left her house with my heart even heavier. Even my own mother thought I should accept in silence, pretend I didn't know, continue living in the lie to maintain appearances. That's what was expected of a woman in the 60s, resignation, sacrifice, silence. But something inside me refused to accept. That spark of dignity, of self-love, that survived the humiliation and betrayal, began to grow. Small at first, almost imperceptible, but fed by each pitying look I received, each lonely night beside a man who didn't respect me. It was on one of those nights while staring at the bedroom ceiling that I had an idea. I couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the betrayal, but I could change my future. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, building a path to the independence Anthony thought impossible. At the mill, besides operating the machines, I had always had skill with sewing. My pieces were praised for their impeccable finishing, careful details. The other workers frequently asked me for help with more delicate work. You have fairy hands, Teresa, Mrs. Carmen, the supervisor, always said. You should sew on your own. You'd earn much more. At the time, I laughed and dismissed the idea. Sew on my own? Where would I get the money to buy a machine, fabrics, threads? How would I get clients? Who would care for the house and children while I sewed? But now, lying in that bed I shared with a stranger I once called husband, the idea didn't seem so absurd anymore. I began doing mental calculations. If I saved a small part of my salary each month, how long would it take to gather enough for a second-hand machine? If I took advantage of the scraps left over at the mill that were normally discarded, how much would I save on materials? If I sewed at night, after the children slept, how many pieces could I produce per week? The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. I still didn't have all the answers, still didn't know exactly how I would do it, but I had a plan. A plan that would start small, grow slowly, require sacrifices and hard work, but that one day, maybe in months, maybe in years, would give me the freedom to look at Anthony and say, I don't need you anymore. That same morning, I looked for Mrs. Carmen at the mill. Do you still think I should sew on my own? I asked while we checked together the functioning of one of the machines. She smiled, her eyes shining with a wisdom that only comes with years and experiences. I do, Teresa. I always have. Your hands are a gift. It would be a waste not to use them. And do you think I could do it? She looked at me for a long moment, as if seeing beyond my words, as if understanding the real question I didn't have courage to ask. I'm sure you can, my daughter, and if you need help getting started, count on me. That's how, with that simple conversation, I planted the seeds of what would become my salvation. That night, instead of crying myself to sleep, I got paper and pencil and began to plan. The first step would be to save for the sewing machine, then get my first clients, probably starting with small repairs and adjustments, gradually taking on larger orders, dresses, outfits, even clothes for special occasions. I didn't know yet, but that night marked the beginning of a new phase in my life. A phase of hard work, sacrifices, learning, but also of growth, self-discovery, and eventually liberation. The path would be long, the road full of obstacles. But for the first time since I saw Anthony and Margaret together in my living room, I felt something different from despair and humiliation. I felt hope. And hope, my dears, is sometimes all we need to take the first step toward a new life. The first weeks after deciding to change my life were of silent sacrifices. I began saving some coins from the grocery money, telling Anthony that prices had gone down or substituting ingredients for cheaper options. A little here, a little there. It seems like little, but for someone already living counting pennies, each saved coin was a small victory. Mrs. Carmen became my ally in this journey. She not only allowed me to take the scraps that would be discarded at the mill, but also began teaching me more advanced sewing techniques during breaks. "Teresa, watch how I do this invisible finish. It's a trick I learned from my mother, who was a seamstress in Nashville," she explained, her wrinkled hands moving with surprising agility over the fabric. At home, while everyone slept, I practiced. Using a needle and thread, I sewed small samples with the mill scraps. The first attempts were disasters: crooked stitches, gathered seams, irregular finishes. My hands, already tired from a full day at the mill, burned and sometimes bled when the needle slipped in the early morning. But I persisted. 3 months later, I had already saved almost half the value of a second-hand sewing machine. I kept the money in a small cookie tin, hidden in the back of the kitchen cabinet, between pots I rarely used. Each time I opened that tin to add some coins, I felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. Pride for what I was achieving, anxiety for the time it would still take. It was around this time that Mrs. Carmen introduced me to Mrs. Eulalia, an elderly widow who lived near the mill and owned an old Singer sewing machine. "Eulalia has arthritis in her hands and can no longer sew," Mrs. Carmen explained. "The machine has been idle for over a year. I talked to her about you." The following Sunday, after lunch, at that same time that previously brought me so much pain, I went to Mrs. Eulalia's house. It was a simple little house, but impeccably clean and organized. In the living room, covered by an embroidered cloth, was the machine, a black Singer, one of those with a pedal, with gold details already somewhat worn by time. "Carmen told me about you," said Mrs. Eulalia, her blue eyes clouded by age but still perceptive. "She said you have fairy hands." "Mrs. Carmen exaggerates," I responded, feeling my face flush. "I still have a lot to learn." "Nonsense. Did you bring anything you've sewn?" Hesitantly, I took from my bag a small piece I had made, a cloth napkin with delicate embroidery on the edges and a monogram in the center. It was a simple piece, but I had dedicated hours to it, perfecting each stitch. Mrs. Eulalia examined the napkin for long minutes, turning it from one side to the other, running her wrinkled fingers over the embroidery stitches, bringing it close to her eyes to better see the details. "Carmen didn't exaggerate," she finally said. "Your hands really have a gift." I felt a warmth in my chest, a mix of pride and gratitude. It was the first time in a long time that someone recognized something of value in me beyond my capacity to be a wife and mother. "This machine has been idle for too long," continued Mrs. Eulalia, caressing the Singer as if it were a pet. "Sewing machines are like people. They need to work, need to create, need to be useful, otherwise they rust and die." She paused, observing me with those eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface. "Would you like to use it, Teresa? I don't have daughters to leave it to, and my nephews don't care about these old things. You could come here in your free time. I would be happy to have company, and the machine would be happy to work again." I felt my eyes fill with tears. It was a generosity I didn't expect, an opportunity that seemed almost miraculous. I don't know what to say, Mrs. Eulalia." "It's so kind of you." "It's not kindness, my daughter, it's practicality. What good is an idle machine to me? And besides, maybe you can sew me some new curtains as payment. Mine are already fading." That's how my partnership with Mrs. Eulalia and her Singer began. 3 times a week, after work at the mill, I would go to her house. At first I just practiced, doing small projects to perfect my technique. Mrs. Eulalia, who had been an excellent seamstress in her youth, shared her knowledge. She corrected my mistakes, taught tricks that weren't in any book. The first orders came from the mill workers themselves. A simple dress for one's daughter, a skirt for another. Adjustments on an outfit for a third. Small jobs, modestly paid, but which gave me experience and, more importantly, confidence. Anthony noticed my absences, of course. When he asked where I was going so many afternoons, I said I was helping Mrs. Eulalia, an elderly and lonely lady who needed company. It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. He didn't question further. He was probably relieved that I had found something to occupy my time, something to distract me from suspicions about him and Margaret. I didn't know at that time if they were still meeting. Part of me wanted to believe that the conversation we had, the discovery of the betrayal, had put an end to that relationship. Another part, more cynical, more hurt, knew they had probably just become more careful. But surprisingly, this no longer consumed me as before. The pain was still there, the sense of betrayal, the humiliation, but now it shared space with something new. Purpose. Each stitch I made on Mrs. Eulalia's singer was a step toward my independence. Each coin I received for a completed job was a brick in building my freedom. 6 months after starting to sew at Mrs. Eulalia's house, I received my first big order, a wedding dress. The daughter of one of my clients was getting married and, having seen the work I did for her mother, wanted me to create her dress. "I don't know if I can, Mrs. Eulalia," I confessed, scared by the responsibility. "A wedding dress is different from everything I've done." "Nonsense," she replied with her usual frankness. "It's just a white dress with more ruffles. You have enough talent, and I'm here to help." For 2 months, I worked on that dress with a dedication I had never dedicated to anything before. Each stitch, each detail, each lace application was done, undone, and redone until achieving perfection. Sometimes I stayed at Mrs. Eulalia's house until late at night, returning home only when I knew everyone would already be sleeping. The result was beyond my expectations. The dress was simple but elegant. The white satin fell in soft lines. The lace applied to the bodice and sleeves created a delicate effect. The veil perfectly complemented the ensemble. When the bride tried it on for the first time and looked at herself in the mirror, her eyes shone with emotion. "It's exactly like I dreamed, Mrs. Teresa," she said, spinning to see the dress from all angles. "It looks like a dress from a magazine." When she paid me, an amount larger than any other I had received until then, she added, "I'm going to tell all my friends who are getting married to look for you. No one in Nashville would do such beautiful work." And so, word by word, client by client, my reputation began to grow. What began as small adjustment jobs transformed into regular orders for complete pieces. Soon, it wasn't just the mill workers looking for me, but their sisters, their cousins, their neighbors. Women I didn't even know began appearing at Mrs. Eulalia's house, asking for the seamstress who made Mrs. Aparecida's daughter's wedding dress. The money I earned was carefully managed. One part went to Mrs. Eulalia as payment for using the machine and for her invaluable guidance. Another part was used to buy materials, better quality fabrics, threads, laces, buttons. And the rest was saved, no longer in the cookie tin, but in a savings account I secretly opened at the bank where Anthony worked. A small rebellion that gave me special satisfaction. At home, things remained superficially the same. I continued caring for the children, the house, fulfilling my role as wife. Anthony and I coexisted in a kind of silent truce. We didn't discuss the past, didn't mention Margaret, pretended nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Joseph, my oldest son, now 14, was the first to notice the transformation in me. "Mom, you're different," he commented one night while helping me dry the dishes after dinner. "Different how, son?" "I don't know how to explain, but stronger. You smile more, and your eyes shine in a way they didn't before." I hugged him, moved by his perception. Children see what adults often can't. "I'm discovering new things about myself, son. Things I didn't even know existed." A year and a half after starting to sew at Mrs. Eulalia's house, something happened that would definitively change the course of my story. The singer, faithful companion of so many creations, began to present problems. The pedal got stuck, the needle broke frequently, the fabric got tangled. "This machine has given what it had to give," sighed Mrs. Eulalia, after another frustrating afternoon trying to fix the mechanism. "It's almost 30 years old, Teresa. It was my wedding present. At the time, it was the best that existed. But now..." I looked at the savings account I kept in my purse. I had saved a considerable amount, much more than I initially planned to buy a used machine. With that money, I could buy a new one, not a latest generation Singer. Those were still beyond my reach, but a good machine, reliable, that would allow me to work more efficiently. But there was something more important I wanted to do with that money. Something I had been silently planning, patiently building, step by step. "Mrs. Eulalia," I said, gathering courage, "what if I opened my own atelier?" The elderly woman's blue eyes widened. Then a smile slowly spread across her wrinkled face. "It was about time you said that, my daughter. I've been waiting for months." That same week, with the help of Mrs. Carmen and Mrs. Eulalia, I began looking for a location. It didn't need to be big, just enough space for the machine, a cutting table, some cabinets to store fabrics and materials, and perhaps a small fitting room. We found the perfect place, a small room in the back of a fabric store that had recently closed. The owner, a gentleman who knew Mrs. Eulalia from long ago, agreed to rent for a reasonable price, especially when he learned I could bring clients to his own store. "The women will come order dresses from you and buy the fabrics here," he reasoned. "It's good business for both of us." With the space secured came the challenge of telling Anthony. Not that I needed his permission. The money was mine, fruit of my work, but I knew I couldn't simply disappear from home to work in my own atelier without giving explanations. I chose a Sunday night for the conversation after the children were already in bed. He was reading the newspaper in the living room as usual when I sat in the armchair across from his. "Anthony, I need to talk to you about something important." He lowered the newspaper, arching an eyebrow. In recent months, we had barely talked beyond what was strictly necessary. I rented a space to open my own sewing atelier. The surprise on his face was genuine. Of everything he could expect me to say, certainly that wasn't on the list. An atelier? With what money? With the money I've been earning sewing at Mrs. Eulalia's house. I've been receiving many orders, more than I can handle in that space. I need my own place with adequate equipment. He was silent for a few moments, processing the information. I expected mockery, disbelief, even prohibition. What I didn't expect was the reaction that came next. "And who's going to take care of the house? The children? Isn't working at the mill enough? Now you want to set yourself up as a professional seamstress?" "I'm leaving the mill," I responded calmly. "The atelier is already earning me more than a worker's salary. And as for the house and children, I'll continue caring for them as I always have. The atelier will be open during the day while Joseph and Marianne are at school and Robert is in kindergarten." He laughed. That contemptuous laugh I already knew well. "This won't work, Teresa. You have no idea what it's like to manage a business. You'll go bankrupt in less than 6 months and come crying, begging for me to pay the debts." I kept calm, determined not to let myself be shaken by his words. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I'll fail, but I need to try. It's something I discovered I love doing, something I'm good at. And if it doesn't work, at least I'll have tried." He stared at me for long seconds, as if seeing me really for the first time in years. There was something in his eyes, surprise, perhaps respect, or just confusion seeing that woman he judged so predictable, so manipulable, suddenly asserting her independence. "Do what you want," he finally said, raising the newspaper again. "But don't come asking for my help when everything collapses." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I knew he was wrong, knew I wouldn't fail, and more importantly, knew that even if I failed, never, ever would I ask for his help. 2 weeks later, Teresa's atelier opened its doors. It was a modest beginning, with a new machine, not the most expensive, but a reliable one. A cutting table made by the local carpenter, shelves for fabrics, and a curtain separating a small space that served as a fitting room. The first month was scary and exciting at the same time. I had clients from the time I sewed at Mrs. Eulalia's house. But would they be enough? Would I be able to pay rent, buy materials, still save some money? The answer came faster than I expected. Not only did the old clients continue looking for me, they brought friends, relatives, acquaintances. The wedding dress I had made generated other similar requests. Soon I found myself so busy I needed to hire help. First, a young woman to attend to clients and do small services. Then, an apprentice to help me with simpler sewing. 6 months after opening, Teresa's atelier not only survived, it prospered. I had a loyal clientele, a reputation for quality and punctuality, and even a small ad in the local newspaper. Anthony, who initially mocked the idea, now avoided the subject. It was obvious my success bothered him. The money I brought home, much more than I ever earned at the mill, he accepted without comments, as if it were his right. As for Margaret, I learned from others that she and Sebastian had moved to another town. Some said their marriage was in crisis, others that Sebastian got a better job in Nashville. I didn't care about the truth. Margaret and her choices were no longer part of my life. What mattered was that in that small atelier on Millbrook's Main Street, a new Teresa was being born. A woman who discovered her strength, her talent, her value. A woman who, stitch by stitch, seam by seam, was rebuilding not just dresses, but her own life. The following years brought changes I could never have imagined on that Sunday afternoon when I discovered Anthony and Margaret's betrayal. My atelier not only survived, it flourished in ways that exceeded even my boldest dreams. I remember perfectly the day I realized I had truly transformed my life. It was 1968, almost 3 years after the atelier opened. A bride from a wealthy family in Nashville came especially to Millbrook to order her dress after seeing what I had created for her cousin. She arrived in a gleaming car, accompanied by her mother and 2 aunts, all elegantly dressed, with discreet but visibly expensive jewelry. "Mrs. Teresa," she said, looking around my small atelier with curiosity. "They told me your hands work magic with fabrics." I smiled, more confident than in the early days, but still surprised when such distinguished clients sought me out. "It's not magic, just hard work and love for what I do." "Whatever it is," the girl's mother intervened. "The dress you made for my niece was the most beautiful I've ever seen. And look, I've been attending weddings in Nashville for decades." They unfolded on my cutting table drawings, magazine clippings, samples of French lace, ideas for the young bride's dream dress. It was an ambitious project, much more elaborate than anything I had done before. The budget I proposed, trembling inside, fearing they would find me too expensive, was accepted without hesitation. "When can we schedule the first fitting?" asked the bride, as if there had never been any doubt I would be chosen to realize her dream. In that moment, looking at those sophisticated women from Nashville trusting me, the mill worker who reinvented herself as a seamstress, I felt a wave of gratitude and achievement I could barely contain. The path had been arduous, full of sleepless nights, fingers hurt by needles, endless calculations to make money stretch without compromising quality. But there was the proof. I had succeeded. That bride's dress opened doors I didn't even know existed. Soon other families from Nashville began looking for me. Wedding dresses, graduation outfits, bridesmaid ensembles. My order schedule, which I used to note in a simple notebook, now needed an entire book with months of advance notice. The small atelier in the back of the fabric store was no longer sufficient. In 1970, I moved to a space 3 times larger on Millbrook's Main Street. I hired 2 more seamstresses to help me, in addition to the young woman who had been working with me from the beginning. I bought more machines, professional cutting tables, fitting mannequins. The discreet sign that previously announced Teresa's atelier was replaced by an elegant facade with gold lettering. Teresa Oliveira, Haute Couture. At home, changes were also evident, though less visible to outside eyes. Joseph, now 19, had entered engineering college in Nashville, something that was only possible thanks to money from my work. Marianne, at 17, showed interest in design and frequently helped me at the atelier, drawing models that impressed even the most demanding clients. And Robert, my youngest at 15, although not interested in sewing, was proud to tell his friends that his mother dressed the most elegant women in the region. As for Anthony, our relationship had transformed into something difficult to define. We were no longer husband and wife in the true sense of the word. We were two strangers who shared a house and 3 children. He continued working at the bank, but his salary, which was once our only source of income, now represented less than half of what I brought home from the atelier. This inversion in traditional roles wasn't easy for him to accept. At first, he tried to diminish my success with depreciative comments. "It's just a phase," he would say. "Soon these Nashville women will get tired of coming to this little town and will look for seamstresses there." When it became clear my business not only persisted, but grew each month, he changed tactics. He began boasting among friends, as if my success were his merit. "I always supported Teresa," I heard him say once to a bank colleague. "I knew she had talent. It was my idea for her to open her own atelier." I could have confronted him, could have exposed his hypocrisy, but I chose silence. Not out of fear or submission like in the past, but because his words no longer had the power to hurt me. I knew the truth, and that was enough. As my financial independence grew, something inside me also changed. The hurt and humiliation I felt upon discovering the betrayal were no longer open wounds. They had scarred, leaving marks I would carry forever, but which no longer bled with each memory. In their place grew something new, the certainty of my own worth, not as someone's wife or someone's mother, but as a woman, as a professional, as a complete human being in myself. It was in this state of mind that, on a summer night in 1973, I made a decision that had been germinating inside me for years. The children were no longer children. Joseph had graduated and worked in Nashville. Marianne was in design college. Robert would finish high school that year. They no longer needed the constant presence of their mother. And I needed something I had postponed for too long, my complete freedom. I waited for Anthony to return from work that afternoon. I sat at the kitchen table and asked that we talk. He seemed tired, irritated with something that had happened at the bank. In other times, this would have made me retreat, wait for a better moment, but not anymore. "I want a divorce, Anthony." The words came out clear, firm, without hesitation. He, who was about to take a sip of coffee, froze with the cup in the air. "What? Divorce? I know it's not legally recognized yet in Tennessee, but we can do a legal separation until the law changes. I've already consulted a lawyer." He put down the cup, his eyes fixed on me, as if trying to determine if I was serious. "This is absurd, Teresa. After all these years, what will people say?" "I don't care anymore what people will say. I care about what I feel. And what I feel is that this marriage ended a long time ago. Actually, it ended that Sunday afternoon when I saw you and Margaret together in our living room." The mention of Margaret brought a flush to his face. Perhaps shame, perhaps anger that I still remembered that after so many years. "It was a mistake. I already apologized. We moved on." "No, Anthony, you moved on. I built a completely new path for myself, and now I want to walk it alone." He went from shock to anger in seconds. "You can't do this. This house is mine. The money you earned all these years was as my wife. Therefore, it's mine too, by law." I smiled, a calm smile that seemed to disconcert him even more. "It's funny how you ignore my work until the moment you think you can claim it. But don't worry, I don't want anything that's yours. The house can stay with you. I have enough money to buy my own house. In fact, I already bought one." His eyes widened. "You what?" "I bought a house, Anthony, on Magnolia Street, near the Atelier. It's smaller than this one, but it has a beautiful garden and it's all mine." He seemed speechless for a moment, trying to process the information. Then, as he always did when he felt cornered, he attacked. "This is because of that thing with Margaret? My God, Teresa, it's been 8 years. Can't you get over it? This isn't about Margaret, not even about you. It's about me, about what I want for the rest of my life." The discussion continued for hours. He threatened, begged, tried to make me feel guilty about the children, about his reputation in town, about throwing away so many years of marriage. But my decision was made. The next morning, I took my clothes and personal items to my new house. The news of our separation spread quickly through Millbrook, as was to be expected. There were disapproving looks, whispers when I passed, indiscreet questions disguised as concern. But surprisingly, there was also support. Mrs. Eulalia, now almost 90 but still lucid and sharp as ever, was the first to visit me at the new house. "It was about time," she said, inspecting the rooms with approval. "I just wonder why it took so long." Mrs. Carmen, who had retired from the mill but was still a constant presence in my life, brought me a pot of lavender for the garden. "So your new house will always have the scent of new beginnings," she explained. I planted that lavender in the center of the garden, and in the years that followed, whenever its perfume invaded the house on summer nights, I remembered that moment of courage and liberation. The 1970s brought not just my personal independence, but also the expansion of my professional horizons. One of my clients from Nashville, owner of a sophisticated boutique, proposed a partnership. I would create an exclusive line of dresses that would be sold in her store. "Your talent is wasted in this small town, Teresa," she said. "Your creations deserve a larger audience." It was an immense challenge. Until then, I had worked mainly by order, creating unique pieces for specific clients. Now I would need to develop an entire collection with various pieces in different sizes, maintaining the quality and exclusivity that had become my trademark. I invested all my savings in this project. I hired more seamstresses, bought imported fabrics, spent sleepless nights designing models, experimenting with cuts, testing finishes. The risk was enormous. If the collection didn't sell, I could lose everything I had built with so much sacrifice. I remember the night before the launch, alone in my house on Magnolia Street, looking at the photos of the finished models spread across the living room table. The fear and insecurity I thought I had overcome returned with full force. Who was I to think I could compete with professional designers? A former mill worker from a small town without formal training, without connections in the fashion world. That night, I dreamed of my mother, deceased years before. In the dream, she took my calloused hands between hers, also marked by decades of hard work, and said, "These hands were made to create beauty, my daughter. Never doubt it." I woke up with renewed certainty. My creations might not follow conventional fashion rules, might not please everyone, but they carried something no school could teach. The authenticity of someone who learned each stitch through trial and error, who put in each seam not just technique, but heart. The collection was a success beyond expectations. The pieces sold out in 2 weeks, something unprecedented for an unknown designer outside traditional fashion circuits. Soon came invitations to other boutiques, to local fashion shows, even for a small feature in a women's magazine from Nashville. At the height of this success, I received an unexpected visit at the atelier. It was an autumn afternoon in 1975. I was finalizing the details of a gala dress when the receptionist announced, "Mrs. Teresa, there's a lady wanting to speak with you. She says she's an old acquaintance." When I raised my eyes from the fabric, I saw Margaret standing in the doorway of my office. She was older, of course, as I was too, but still recognizable. Her hair, once black, now mixed with gray, her face with more lines, but the same restless eyes, the same slightly hunched posture. "Teresa," she said, her voice trembling. "May I come in?" I was silent for a few moments, so many conflicting emotions arising at once that I didn't know which one to express first. "Come in," I finally said, indicating the chair in front of my desk. She sat down, her hands restless in her lap, her eyes avoiding mine. "You did it," she said, looking around the elegant atelier that had once been just a distant dream. "All this is impressive." "What do you want, Margaret?" I asked, without beating around the bush. Time had healed many wounds, but I wasn't willing to waste it with empty conversation. "I need a job," she responded, her voice almost disappearing. "Sebastian left me 2 years ago for a younger woman." The irony of the situation didn't escape me. Life sometimes has a peculiar sense of humor. "I heard you're hiring seamstresses," she continued. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you after what I did, but I'm desperate, Teresa. No one wants to employ a